We thought it was routine. It was the kind of job we'd been doing since I was a private. A short notice, structural, and security assessment of a government asset tucked into a mountain. That's how they sold it to us. Routine inspection, the briefing officer said. No surprises, limited access, follow orders. It was Appalachia, June of 1971. The year's heat already pressing against the tree line. The road into the ridge sagging into fog by night. We never imagined what sitting under that ridge would do to us. If this kind of military mystery interests you, and you want more accounts told straight from people who were there, stick around, subscribe, and turn on the bell. I'll tell it like I remember it. My name is not important. You can call me by the rank I held then, Sergeant. I'll use names for the others because they deserve to be remembered. There were 4 of us in the assessment team assigned that morning. Me as squad lead, Corporal Mac McCready handling security and door protocols, Specialist Ruiz on communications and instruments, and Private First Class Benton on transport and gear. We were attached to an engineer detachment, a small National Guard unit temporarily federalized for this job, which made sense for roadwork and stability assessments in rough terrain. Our liaison was Captain Harrow, a civil affairs officer with the sort of clipped voice that left nothing to interpretation. The convoy left base just before dawn. Old deuce-and-a-half trucks and a couple of 4x4s bumped through back roads that hugged the mountain like an old scar. In the cab, the radiator hissed. Wind pushed dust into the open windows. We watched ridges stack up like waves. People in the little valley town we passed stared as if they had seen us before, which they might have in different uniforms, different years, but nobody asked anything. That was part of the arrangement. The mountain held its secrets, and the town minded its own. We were given a cover story for anyone who asked, a mineral survey to check old shafts and ensure public safety. The official paperwork we carried was thin, a single folder of coordinates, an order signed by an indefinito clearance. I was told afterward to mark the exact designation as indefinito, and a set of instructions hard and plain. Do not photograph unauthorized areas, do not interact with lab staff beyond escorted zones, and report any anomalies up the line immediately. It felt small and oddly final. Captain Harrow's briefing at the staging area was as brief as our orders. He stared at the map with the blue ink smudged from too many hands and said, "You'll be met at the ridge by a facility representative. You'll be escorted. You check structural supports, life safety systems, and evacuation paths. If you find anything outside that scope, you bring it up to me and we decide. No talking to the press, no photographs except what's required on the inspection sheets. You clear?"
He said it like he was reading from a checklist he'd recited 1,000 times. None of us suspected then that the checklist would be useless. Our escort was a civilian in plain clothes who introduced himself as Colonel Fletcher, a title and uniform that didn't quite match the overalls he wore. He had the posture of someone used to command and a cigarette stub tucked under his lip like punctuation. The site entrance looked like a maintenance access for some mining operation, a concrete portal cut into the mountain's face, reinforced doors that took 2 men to open, and a guard booth with a single lantern that bleared against the shade. Beside the entrance, a faded sign read Mine Shaft 7, but that was likely part of the cover. The road down to the gate narrowed into gravel churned by tracked vehicles and tractors. When Fletcher waved us through, his eyes measured us and then slipped away, like he could see both us and something beyond in the same glance. Everyone at the gate was on edge, in the way people are when the rules of normal life are temporarily suspended. There was a small detachment of civilian researchers, whitecoats that had been muddied to the cuffs, and a skeleton crew of technicians who answered to a name I was told to file as indefinito, their supervisory program designation, not for me to say. They moved with purpose, not haste. Purpose is the habit of people who expect things to go wrong and prepare for them. They made us go through decontamination procedures at the entrance. Not a complete biohazard suit-up. This was 1971, and they were not running luxury exercises, but a shoe scrub, an overcoat swap, and respirator checks. The respirators were cumbersome, the kind that fogged behind lenses and tasted slightly of rubber and oil. We were told the respirators were a precaution. Old ventilation, someone said, as if that explained everything. There were mechanical airlocks, thick doors that clanged shut with a finality that sat heavy in my chest, and the sound of them was the first thing I remember being real. Metal on metal, clicks and indexes and seals that hissed. As we descended, the air began to change the further we went below the ridge. The mountain swallowed sunlight. The lights in the passageways were industrial bulbs that buzzed with age. The temperature dropped a few degrees. My breath condensed now and then in the pool of our headlamp cones. The corridor walls were concrete with that damp sheen that absorbs sound. There was an odor that wasn't quite chemical and wasn't quite biological, a metallic edge mixed with something sweet and old, like pennies left in the rain. It stuck to the back of the throat. I'll tell you plainly, we found places on no map. That's the simplest, honest thing about it. Our official plans and the facilities books lined up to a point, storage wings, mechanical rooms, a few labs, but there were corridors that stopped answering to the drawings.
At one junction, Specialist Ruiz pulled a bundle of schematics from a folder he'd been given and traced a line. "This stops here," he said, tapping a stamped blueprint. "There should be a service shaft. There's nothing that shows this corridor on paper." He looked at me. "Did we miss a sheet?" Mac ran a felt marker along the cement and said, "Someone put a wall on the books." He was practical. He used words that were tools, not poetic. Where the blueprints ended, the hallway continued. It narrowed and slanted down in a way that suggested the builders cut into an older vein of rock and then retrofitted over time. Along the walls, small brass plates were screwed in at irregular intervals, engraved with odd symbols we couldn't place. The researchers shrugged and said those plates were part of an internal labeling system. The way they said it made me think they were saying it because it was the only plausible thing to say. Ruiz's instruments began picking up small anomalies as we pushed deeper. A low, steady hum that didn't match the facility's mains frequency, localized electromagnetic irregularities that made a compass needle twitch, and a faint background on a reel-to-reel monitoring device that sounded like a low, regular thump. The equipment smelled of oil and dust, and was the kind of aging analog tech that glowed green on its CRT tube and clicked with relays. The PRC pack radios we carried stayed constant in their static. Their channels were full of the usual chatter at the surface. Below, their voices thinned. We came upon a door that didn't exist on any chart we'd been given. It was steel, pitted with time, and it had no markings except a faint stencil, Level X. The X was carved into the paint by hand, like someone had been too pragmatic for formal labels. A small mechanical lock pad sat beside it, a wheel with sliding tabs and a crank that looked older than any of use, something mid-century, built to be operated and maintained without electronic magic. The technicians in the white coats fell quiet when we stood there. One of them, a man with a voice like gravity and a name tag that said Dr. Waller, finally spoke. "Level X is not on the official manifest," he said, clearing his throat as if he regretted having to name it at all. "It's ancillary. We keep minimal records for the safety of the operation. You'll be escorted. You will not leave the designated perimeter. Understood?" His face wore the weary privacy of someone who had signed papers he couldn't later undefend. We were told the area was a legacy containment wing, older concrete retrofitted with newer steel bracing, and a ring of added reinforcements, the kind of thing that makes a structure sound like it contains tension. Dr. Waller had a manner like a man who had opted for truth where he could and evasion where he could not. He told us the tanks down there were for study and that they were non-standard biological specimens.
He used the phrase like it was a plumbing term. He did not use the word creature or being. That choice mattered because words do things. They cage reality. The containment chambers themselves were round rooms, like old water towers sunk into concrete sleeves. Windows set into thick, reinforced glass reflected our headlamp cones back to us. Behind one of those windows was the first thing that unspooled the kind of silence that fills a room with weight. A form elongated and folded like a reed in water. I've seen a lot in my life. I have stood in the mouths of collapsing bridges and under the beating heat of desert sun. Nothing in my standard training prepared me for the way that figure made the back of my neck tighten. I can't give you a biological catalog. I am not a scientist. I can only say what I saw. Tall, taller than a man when it uncoiled, with limbs that seemed too long for a torso, a head that leaned forward in a way that suggested listening, and eyes that were large and dark, reflecting like wet stones in the lamp. The skin had a sheen like oil under a moon. It didn't thrash. It did not behave like a caged animal. It oriented toward us with a slow, deliberate intelligence, the tilt of a head, a shift, an awareness of being watched back. There were tanks of other sizes, cylindrical chambers that held smaller subjects in a kind of suspended state. One was visibly damaged, the kind of scar tissue on glass that comes from impact. The small subject inside, smaller than a full-grown man, curled and still, lay partly obscured by cables and sediment. The technicians muttered about sample degradation and transport protocols. Dr. Waller said, "We're trying to keep them stable." That sentence was half a confession and half an instruction. I kept thinking of the town below and the schoolhouse bell that rang each morning. The idea that beneath the ridge, at a depth where trees became roots, there were beings cataloged like mineral samples made my stomach hollow. It posed a question I wasn't trained to answer. What do you do when your procedures encounter a conscience in a lab coat? We ran scans. The analog meters ticked. The green phosphor of a CRT monitor traced lines and then a new spike. One of the gauges, an age-worn telemetry readout, climbed past the expected threshold. There was a little chime on the console, the sort of warning that is not loud but insists on being noticed. A technician tried to explain it away. Thermal drift from the chiller, he said. He said it quickly, too quickly. A young lab tech, hands still damp from whatever wash they used under the sink, looked at me when he thought no one else was listening. He said, "They watch when we move. Not with eyes like us. Different." His voice cracked on the last word. He was the kind of person who thought honesty would be a relief. His admission lodged like a pebble in my boot. The facility's instruments were a patchwork of older and newer systems.
There were reel-to-reel recorders with paper logbooks stacked on shelves, and there were newer, hardened boxes of equipment modified by whoever was in charge. The control room smelled like solder and stale coffee. The monitors glowed with green traces that crawled like small creatures themselves. A console flickered where digital readouts were absent. Mechanical analog switches clacked under gloved fingers. There was a manual override panel labeled Emergency Lockdown, Manual Cycle, in a stencil that looked improvised. The emergency protocol sat there, mechanical and simple, locks, pneumatic seals, and a series of keyed cranks that could isolate compartments. It was the kind of design that favored brute force over subtlety. It told me they had thought about containment as a problem of hardware first. At one point, Dr. Waller pulled me aside and told me, almost apologetically, about the facility's failsafes. "If anything breaches containment," he said, his hands rubbing together like a man wiping off guilt, "we trigger an internal lockdown. It scrambles outgoing lines to prevent panic and seals the levels with mechanical actuators. We can isolate sections from the surface and keep systems running on internal generators. The goal is containment," he added with a look that might have been pity or fear. "If anyone has to make hard decisions, they'll come from higher up." When I pressed him about how the comms would be cut, he explained in the kind of plain technical language men use when they want to sound harmless. "Analog scrambler on the line, field generator. We can jam external bands and operate on an internal closed loop. Doors physically tie down. It's not like the outside hears us go quiet. We simply disappear." He used the phrase, "we simply disappear," as if describing a power outage. That phrase sat on me like a cold stone. What he was describing, in my terms, was a silent lockdown. No screaming sirens to alert the town, no ticker tape for the press, nothing that registered on the outside until command decided what story to tell. The mechanics were analog, pneumatic locks, hydraulic clamps, and an electromagnetic field that, when applied, distorted external pickup on radios and early CRT telemetry. It was crude, it was effective, and it carried the kind of finality that lives in caskets. At one point I asked the question that sat at the back of everyone's tongue. What are they? Dr. Waller looked away. He said, "We call them specimens. That's the protocol. Beyond that," he shrugged, "beyond that is speculation." He gave me the sort of look that a man gives to keep his own mind from going entirely where he fears. Then he added, "We're not in a position to say they're extraterrestrial. We don't have that confirmation. We don't rule out anything yet." That was as much clarity as he could afford. I did not like being the kind of man who could accept half answers, but the uniform teaches you to follow a chain.
We were only an assessment team. We leaned on procedure because procedure is where responsibility goes when the world is too heavy to hold with judgment alone. Still, in the quiet between checks, I noticed things that didn't match the official description of storage-level study. There were transfer harnesses and heavy-duty carries that looked like the kind used to move bodies. There were restraint points on the floor, like the anchors of a ship's chains. There were notes on clipboards, scrawled and half erased, that read in a shorthand none of us were trained to decode. A junior technician, a man I later learned had been here longer than anyone else in the research wing, caught my eye and mouthed a word across his lips as we passed by. "Sorry," he said under his breath. "We didn't volunteer for this." His apology seemed personal. It felt like an attempt to unburden himself of complicity. We continued further into the lower ring, guided by Dr. Waller and a bearded security chief named Phillips, whose eyes had the hard set of armor. At a junction where the concrete gave way to old timbers and a patched metal door, Phillips sighed and said, "I've escorted delegations before, never to something like this." He kept his voice low, as if reverence and fear were the same thing. We saw evidence of maintenance operations, rusted scaffolding, blankets of mineral sediment clinging to pipework, notation stamps bearing dates that slid into the late 1960s. Where newer work had been done, it looked like surgeons grafting modern systems onto old rock. Someone had reinforced an older concrete ring with steel ribs, bolting them deep and heavy.
You could feel the strain in the seams under the weight of the mountain. Keeping something like that contained is not just about locking a door. It is about physics, about balancing pressures and holding seams together. That reality was not reassuring. At the edge of one chamber, Specialist Ruiz set down his Geiger counter and frowned. It was old tech, but in those days it was the best there was for basic radiation profiling. The needle ticked in a way that suggested background levels elevated but not alarmingly so. He muttered, "No gamma spikes, nothing nuclear." He said it like he was closing a door on a rumor. He added, "But there's something that throws the instruments off in pulses, electromagnetic bursts maybe." The instruments registered a low-frequency signature that repeated on a cycle like a heartbeat. I remember thinking how odd and intimate the rhythm felt. We were told to document everything on paper, typed reports and log entries that would be filed and that were, in theory, part of an audit trail. They gave us a camera that used film, heavy and mechanical in the way cameras were before instant tech ruined the art of waiting. I snapped photographs of bulkheads and support beams, of the reinforced glass, of the marks on the floor where a car tick swiped. Each click felt illicit.
If anything in that facility ever became public, the film would be the first and most obvious proof, and that thought made me uneasy in a practical way. There were moments when I lost my composure. Standing before those tanks, looking at the beings behind glass, I felt the raw animal hunger of a man wanting to reach out and touch what he cannot have. I wanted to know whether those eyes reflected pain, curiosity, hunger, or something else. I wanted to know whether intelligence always meant our kind of thought. Would they bandage themselves and find bread? Would they use language? The scientist in me, and I use that word loosely because I have only the curiosity to claim it, wanted to ask, how do you tell if a life is aware? But station and discipline held my tongue. Questions travel poorly through orders. It's worth saying here that official records, the ones I later tried to find and the ones friends of mine requested on my behalf, do not show this as a public event. According to the archives released to the public and the Freedom of Information paperwork that makes it out into the daylight, there was no significant incident at the coordinates I carried in that folder. That is not my claim about what happened. It is a statement about what the record says. It matters because it leaves us with the silence of paperwork where I have memory. It is the first time I realized there was a gulf between what I know I saw and what the ledger of record would ever admit. The people working there were, how do I say this without inventing bravery for them? They were human in small ways. One of the scientists, a woman named Elise, who kept her hair tied up under a kerchief and had ink smudges on her fingers, caught my eye at a transit and said, "We didn't have a choice either. Don't think of us as monsters." Her face looked like someone who'd accepted moral pinch as routine. I believed her. It was not the kind of place where monsters laughed and drank. It was a place where men and women performed tasks and then carried the choices like stones in their pockets. We recorded our initial findings, filed our checks, and then stood in a room that smelled of sterilizer and old metal. In the corner, a whiteboard had notations about transfer times and medical windows. There were references to protocols listed under a header labeled as an internal designation I was not cleared to repeat. I will call it Program Indefinito here because I cannot establish its real-world correlate. The name was not important to me, only the shape of the thing, a project that had been given autonomy and then the right to silence. Before we left the lower ring that day, Dr. Waller pulled me aside and told me about a contingency in case of contagion or breach. We have built-in shutoffs, mechanical clamps on doorways, magnetic seals where electrical systems won't reach. And if communications start to leak, we have scramblers that can isolate us from the outside bands. You won't know it's happening until it's done. You'll just find the surface quiet. He said it like he was describing a secure vault. I think he was trying not to tell me what we would have done in his place. We signed our initial report and then descended into the deepest mapped chamber, the place where the older concrete met the newer bracing. It felt like the mountain's lungs. Lights flickered. There was a hush that held the clang of our boots like a thing to be noticed. At the far wall, behind a circular array of tanks, they had set up a transfer cradle, a metal sling on rails the size of a stretcher that suggested movement designed for life, not just for inert samples. When Mac tapped the glass and the big one turned toward the sound, the air in my chest went cold. It moved with the fluidity of something born to motion, not jerky like a trapped animal. It watched us with an attention that was not reflex. I do not want to sensationalize that moment by suggesting it smiled or made human gestures. It did not. But there was a recognition in its posture that read to me, to my simple trained eyes, as awareness. For a moment, the lab's authority and my uniform felt hollow against the question its gaze asked. What rights apply to something that notices you? That question is the reason I have had trouble sleeping since. Duty said records and notifications and the chain of command. Humanity said you do not lock away what looks back at you in a way that could morally plead. The two ideas do not fit together neatly. Part of me, the part that wears uniforms and salutes at the flag, wanted to file the findings and leave. Part of me walked to the glass when no one watched and pressed a finger to the cool surface. There, in that tilt of light and shadow, I thought I saw a motion like a small curl of a limb, not violent, not stereotypically animal, but a movement that might have been curiosity. That image has been a splinter in my memory box ever since. It is as solid in my head as the sound of the door sealing shut behind us when we finally left the lower ring. On the way back up the corridor, as we retraced our steps, Specialist Ruiz checked the radios. He tapped the PRC pack and frowned. "Shortwave's funny down here," he said. "There's a field that scrambles anything at range, makes it a closed net." His voice carried more worry in it than the words alone conveyed. "If we trigger a lockdown," he added, "we lose the surface link." That phrase, "trigger a lockdown," hung between us like the throttle of a bomb. We had orders to preserve life and to preserve the facility. We also had orders to defer to command. None of those directives explained how to handle an intelligence in a tank. As we re-emerged toward the surface, the light changed. The mountain let air through in a way that felt like a release.
Colonel Fletcher met us at the portal, his cigarette stub bright against his knuckles. He checked the report and then folded it into his hand like a small secret book. He gave us a look that said, without words, that we had reached the first gate, and now the second gate would be held by others. "You did what you were sent to do," he said. "Thank you. We'll take it from here." Somewhere during the climb upward, back in the trucks, I felt a weight lift and a different one press down. What I had seen was real in the only way that matters to me. It was affirmed by my senses and by the instruments that ticked. What I could find in files later was another matter. The two things started to drift apart from that moment forward. The days after the inspection were confusing in the small bureaucratic way we know so well in the military. Papers moved. A senior officer with a name I was told to record as indefinito, fictional/indefinito, convened a face-to-face in the base command trailer and asked about protocol adherence. We handed over our signed sheets. We were thanked, twice, in a way that suggested the thanks had been rehearsed. Then we were given reassignment orders that had the formal look of career advancement, lateral moves, nothing extraordinary, and a packet with a clause that would later make my lawyers frown if they'd seen it. A non-disclosure agreement printed on thin paper and stamped with a clearance level I was not authorized to repeat. They told us the NDA was standard. They told us forgetting was patriotic. They told us to file the memory away with the rest of the mundane routine that keeps soldiers from turning every order into an existential crisis. I deferred. I signed the forms. I went home. But the mountain did not go home with me. There were nights when I would wake with a start, feeling the weight of damp concrete and the metallic tang in my mouth. In the quiet rooms of my life after discharge, I would see a tall shape tilt its head and read a question in its eyes that had no easy answer. Sometimes I'd wonder whether someone would dig up that ridge one day, whether a clamp would give way and the world would be forced to reckon with what had been held in silence for so long. Right now, as I stand here telling you this, I will not say definitively what those beings were. I will not say they were from in between worlds or from the stars. I will not tell you that they were monsters or angels. What I can tell you is what an assessment turned into: the discovery of sealed corridors not on record, reinforced tanks holding living forms, instruments that registered unfamiliar pulses, and a promise of a procedure that could make the place vanish from the surface's knowledge, an analog silent lockdown that would keep the world unaware until top command decided otherwise. And I can tell you how the people who worked there looked at what they had locked down, with the mix of duty and guilt that stays in a person's face like a shadow.
We left that day and the mountain closed, but not like a safe with money inside. It closed like a mouth, leaving questions that needed air. The rest of the story is not a neat report. It is where decisions are made in smoke-filled rooms, and where coils of chain and detonators and late-night orders form the moral geometry someone must walk through. That part is the one where we were reduced from witnesses to actors ordered to obey. That part is where the measures were considered that would end the facility in a way that could never be satisfactorily explained. When I was discharged months later, they offered me things that were supposed to be comforts: a commendation, a relocation, a quiet transfer. I took what I needed to get away.
But what I could not take with me was the blankness of official record and the small complicity of knowing where orders could take a man. People asked whether I believed in extraterrestrials after I spoke to them. They wanted to put the story into boxes. I refused. I trusted my senses, and I trusted the people who had told me, in offhand phrases, that sometimes the world is kept from knowledge because someone decided ignorance would serve peace. There is more to tell: a breach, alarms, things moving beyond their glass, decisions at higher levels that turn to demolition and rebel. There are names that I cannot speak aloud without their clearance designations being indefinito. There are images that do not leave me: the tilt of a head against glass, the clank of a mechanical seal, the brief impression that a being tried to reach us in the only way it could. Those things I will tell you, but not yet. Right now, the mountain remains a place that held things under concrete and clamps, and in the brittle glow of green monitors, things that watched us back. If you think this matters, tell someone, ask questions, but remember, a story told as testimony is not the same as a ledger entry. This is what I witnessed. This is what lives with me. The rest is still sealed under the ridge. The breach happened at night. We'd been back at the ridge because of a call that sounded routine on paper, a transfer of specimens from deep containment to a secure transport bay. That's what the memo read, in a single stamped line that looked like good handwriting over a bad decision. I'd been told I was to accompany logistics and act as a liaison. In practice, they wanted men who had seen the lower rings and could keep order if something went wrong. I thought of the last time I'd stood behind glass and seen those dark eyes turn toward us. I shouldn't have believed the invitation would be harmless. We drove up in a different convoy than the four: more trucks, a flatbed with crates lashed down, and a pickup that carried 2 men in civilian suits and a young lieutenant who did not look like he'd slept. The town down below, a place called Cross Hollow on the maps we were handed, was asleep when we passed.
The road up into the mountain was slick with a late storm, and the headlights cut wet paths through fog. The plant lights at the portal bled into the dark like a wound. When we pulled in, the new security posture was obvious. There were more guards, uniformed military now, not just researchers. A detachment in fatigues had set up a cordon at the staging area. The men looked nervous in a way that doesn't show up on a paperwork line: tight jaws, hands that kept going to pockets as if they expected papers to be handed to them. Colonel Fletcher met us at the gate, same cigarette stub, but his posture had slumped a degree or two. He gave me a nod that felt like a dismissal and said, "You'll be attached to Transfer Detail Bravo. Keep your head down and follow orders." Dr. Waller was there too, and he looked older than before. The sleeplessness under his eyes was the kind that timestamps. He didn't meet my gaze for long. A man from command, a general whose name I was later told to file as indefinito, had flown in and set up a command post in the old mine office. That made the tension climb. When a show of rank arrives, things that might have been argued in quiet get resolved by fiat. The plan, in simplest terms, move a select set of subjects from Tank Row 7 to an upper corridor where a transport cradle stood ready. Crates would be sealed on dampening mats, then loaded onto the flatbed to be driven off the site under escort. The movement would be strictly timed. The researchers spoke in low, clipped sentences about sedation protocols and harnessing, about trays of sedatives and clamps that would not harm tissue but would inhibit movement. I listened because my job was to watch the process and make sure the structural points were sound. We walked down with the team just after midnight. The facility then felt like a living mouth at rest. The hum of pumps and the tick of analog clocks, the quieted breathing of generators. The tank-lit rows cast pale reflections on the wet concrete. The air smelled of chilled water and metallic tangs. Machines that had been idle during the days hummed awake under hands that knew their names. Someone rolled a transfer cradle into place, a rig that looked like great ribs on rails, and technicians clipped on straps and checked their knots. There were more of them out that night than before: technicians, security, and a detachment of men who specialized in containment transfer, a euphemism they used for moving whatever a facility decided must go. They wore heavy gloves and carried cases of instruments. They had guns too, strapped low and not advertised. The kind of paranoia that escorts heavy things is always present in these places. It tastes like disinfectant and fear. We started at Tank 7, the same chamber where I had first seen the tall form. When the glass was fogged and somebody pulled back a shroud, the thing inside was lit in a way that made its silhouette look like sculpture.
The harness was set, and the straps were looped gently around limbs that didn't fit our categories. The researchers moved like surgeons, hands quick but oddly tender. Dr. Waller told me in a small voice that they hoped sedation would be sufficient to quiet the organism's reflexes during transit. There was laughter then, not the kind that lightens, the strained sort that people produce to pretend nerves are humor. A tack accidentally dropped a tool, and one of the men nearest the tank swore softly. It's the little human noises that remind you of life in a place that otherwise runs on machines. The transfer cradle engaged, bolts clicked, and a slow, precise lift began. For a heartbeat, everything was mechanical and expected. The rails hummed, chains creaked, and the carriage moved with the learned gentleness of those who have moved many things they want to survive the trip. The tall form shifted, but it did not thrash. It tilted its head in the direction of the movement, and for a second I thought the motion was one of compliance. Then the lights flickered. It was not a cinematic blackout. It was small, a hiccup in the facility's power that lasted a breath and then resolved. The CRT monitors blinked and came back, the fluorescent strips thrummed, and someone cursed. The transfer continued. Then the nuisance became a pattern, a high, soft whining that resonated through steel and rebar. Instruments on the console recorded a pulse, like the one we'd heard in the corridor during my first visit, but stronger. The technicians checked valves and gauges and said, "Ratcheting spasm. It'll pass." They spoke as if naming an illness made it less malevolent. Then an alarm, not loud like in the movies, but a single red lamp that started to flash, and a small bell somewhere in the upper control room that meant local breach. That light turned to multiple lamps in sequence, and the lab's built-in intercom gave a low mechanical tone. People moved faster. Orders were issued. Secure the cradle. Isolate the corridor. The console printed out a thin strip from the reel-to-reel log, a black line that snapped into a curve like a heartbeat gone wrong. Someone in the lab shouted, I heard it over the hum, "Containment door 3, seal it." The pneumatic rams over the bulkhead started up with a prolonged hiss. That hiss was the sound that ages later would replay in my sleep, the sound of seals dropping and the mountain taking in a breath. We heard pounding from the direction of the adjacent wing, the older sector, a wet slapping sound against metal, the sort of noise you get when something moves through a corridor lined with service ducts. Phillips, the bearded security chief, grabbed Mac's arm and pulled him toward the nearest stairwell. "Block that route," he barked. "We'll hold this line." And in the same motion, he looked at Dr. Waller as if asking permission to do what soldiers are for. Then the radios, the service channels, went strange.
Static welled up and pushed the voices down until they were muffled ghosts. I thumbed my PRC pack and felt the channel flattened into noise. Specialist Ruiz cursed under his breath and switched to an alternate loop, but the field seemed to clip the signal. The consoles in the control room showed the external line dropping away, as if the facility had been set inside a Faraday cage. That is the least poetic way to say what happened. The silent lockdown engaged. The manual cycle on the emergency panel, the one labeled in crude stencil as Emergency Lockdown Manual Cycle that Dr. Waller had shown me, spun into action automatically. Hydraulic clamps slammed, door bolts drove home, pneumatic seals hissed closed. The analog scrambler I'd been briefed on earlier began to emit a low-frequency field that interfered with radio pickup. Out on the surface, the truck engines would still be idling and headlights turning, but whatever happened inside those ribs of reinforced concrete would not register easily beyond the mountain's shields. I recalled the exact taste in my mouth when the outside went silent, metal and dust and a tightness behind the teeth. It sounded, in the way memory colors sound, like being underwater and watching bubbles try to carry words to the surface. For someone trained to read orders, the scene was inverted. The orders were there, but the machine that relayed them had been put to sleep. We were separated from the world not by distance, but by a deliberate mechanical and electronic choice. Then the real noises began, not alarms, but movement that did not belong to machines. There was the sound of an impact on plate, not with the cadence of an animal's paw, but the thump of large body contacting metal and sliding. A bright emergency lamp stuttered and went red. Somewhere ahead, a clanging like a pipe being hammered shook the floor. It was as if a mountain inside us had rubbed one of its teeth loose. The men on the transfer detail had orders: contain, report. The men with guns had orders: suppress a threat to personnel. Those directives sound neat on paper. They are not when someone you know drops to their knees and says what no one wants to hear. It doesn't respond to pain like we do. I watched a young corporal, not more than 20, kneel and put his rifle down because he couldn't bring himself to raise it at the figure that had slipped from its tank, and stood, for a terrible second, half in shadow and half lit by red emergency glow. What the thing did then I will try to say without turning it into spectacle. It did not lunge. It didn't scream. It moved with the threaded patience of something that knew the geometry of its environment. It slipped between piping like a river finding the low place in a bedrock. Its limbs, long and spidery, flexed with a careful economy. It avoided cables. It did not appear to be trying to escape so much as to move toward a place it had been denied.
It looked, and I am deliberate with that verb, as if it was following memory. The first real confrontation happened at a choke point, a stairwell lined with maintenance lockers. A piece of heavier metal had been wedged at the top as a temporary brace. A smaller subject, damaged and bleeding condensate from a wound that glistened but did not spray gore, tried to climb when the guard set his foot against the brace. The guard found himself in the impossible place of having to decide whether to put a bullet in something that raised a hand. The hand, if it was a hand, curled in a motion that might have been entreaty. The guard fired. No detail of the discharge is satisfying to remember. The sound of a rifle in an enclosed stairwell is a physical thing, loud, rich, and full of spittle. The small subject collapsed with an odd, soft falling motion. It did not thrash. The men who fired felt something shift in their faces, as if a line had been crossed into an area that left a permanent mark. Mac swore softly, and then, like a man washing his hands, turned away and barked orders. "Get back to the cradle corridor," he snapped. "We move to the transport and don't stop." That was when the situation fragmented. Teams split to push the remaining subjects into containment corridors. The transfer cradle had stopped halfway, the carriage rails had jammed, and someone had to crawl under to free the mechanism. The big one, the tall form, had found a service hatch and slipped through a maintenance shaft with a sound that was like damp cloth. It emerged in a section where the lights were poor and the air had a cold scent. A tech reached for a flare, and that small burst of light made the thing pause and turn. For a breath we stared at it. It looked back. I remember being tempted to speak. To speak seemed both foolish and essential. "Easy," I wanted to say. "We're not your enemy." Would that had been the language. But we had weapons and standing orders. The containment team leader, whom I will refer to as Sergeant L because his real designation was indefinito in the documents they gave us, shouted that if it went past the decon corridor, the surface would be at risk, and that rules said to neutralize if needed. The words slid out like a blade. The men tightened their grips and fired. The thing reacted in a way that turned a comfortable metaphor into something else entirely. It recoiled, and for a single second I swear I saw a shape that looked like alarm, not the jag of a startled animal, but something like the tightening around the eyes when a fellow human is hurt. That moment fixed itself in my head like a splinter. It made orders look suddenly wrong. Despite the shooting, more subjects were moving through the facility in scattered paths. Some disappeared into old shafts, others seemed to understand doors and used them, pushing with forelimbs that worked like hands.
There was a small structural failure when a support rib that had been patched in the 60s gave under strain. The vibration set off a cascade of loose sediment, and a chunk of concrete fell and blocked part of the egress route. A man was pinned briefly by a slab and saved by 2 technicians who hauled him free. None of that feels cinematic in memory. It feels like hands and rope and men who found they could still move. Then the orders came down from the command tent, crisp and without mercy. Secure any survivors, evacuate non-essential personnel, and prepare for demolition if the facility could not be secured within the hour. The voice on the line belonged to the general I had been told to mark as indefinito. He was short, practical, and delivered the kind of directive that ends debates. If we can't get a confirmed chain of custody on specimens and the integrity of containment is compromised, we will deny access and conduct controlled demolition, he said. The words were military, leveled, like a surgeon setting a limb. He added, "This will protect the local population and prevent intelligence exploitation." I asked the question no one wanted to answer aloud. Demolition, that doesn't mean burying living things? The answer was a drawn breath and a bureaucratic phrase. The procedure includes neutralization of biological vectors and full closure. We will make a decision based on what we secure. There was a silence after that. It was the kind of silence that arranges itself when people understand that inference is the same as action. We got volunteers then. Teams rounded up people to carry out transfer, to sweep corridors, to retrieve any stations not accounted for. I was on the rear detail, assigned with Mac and Benton to keep a path open to the transport cradle. We were to be the last out if anything went wrong. That is how these things get decided. Somebody must be the rear. Benton, who had been quiet until then, suddenly started to cry, in a way that men who have been taught to hide cry. It was not theatrical, it was a small, private thing made a public fault line. "We're not supposed to do this," he said, voice cracking. "We signed up to fix roads, not to push people into pits." He had the look of a man trying to reconcile orders with conscience. The firefight went on, scattered and old-fashioned. Men with M14s and M16s exchanged bursts with things that used corridors like they were watercourses. A few subjects were driven into dead ends and, under orders, were secured with the mesh restraints we had seen before. They were heavy and awkward to move, strapped to gurney-like cradles. The technicians worked with a tenderness that made your skin ache. They wrapped limbs, set clamps to arterial points, and used sedatives measured by hands that trembled. When a live subject was captured, the mood shifted for a moment from panic to something like reverence. We moved them as if they might remember the touch, and that memory could matter.
There were casualties among us. Not many, mercifully, but enough to make the mess hall later stink of burnt coffee and mourning. One man in a flak jacket, I will not use his name because it was later redacted with an indefinito flag, took a wound in the thigh from a sliver of protruding rebar displaced during a scuffle. He bled slow and quiet. The medics worked, and we loaded him onto a stretcher. I recall his hand gripping mine for a second, hard and hot, as if to anchor himself to human life. Even as we tended to the hurt, men in suits from command were already scribbling diagrams and arguing over charge placement. The suggestion was chillingly pragmatic. Use the old service voids to collapse key supports, stage the charges to bring the ring down inward, and seal the tanks beneath tons of rubble. In their view, demolition was a controlled end, a concept, a vector of national security. For the rest of us who had watched eyes at glass and felt the cogency of a gaze interrupt our certainties, the plan felt like an ethical erasure. I remember Dr. Waller coming up to me, eyes wet and old. He said in a voice barely a whisper, "We can't let them wander out." I asked him what he meant by let, and he said, "They would be studied by people who do not see value in life, Sergeant. The choice is between containment and control. We've tried containment. Control is what the program wants." There he gave a small animal noise that was perhaps a laugh or a sob. He added, "I'm sorry." That was all he said which mattered. The general's decision came with the bluntness a ledger entry. If the facility could not be secured within 30 minutes, charges would be placed and detonated to collapse the lower rings and keep any biological material below. The language in his mouth made it sound tidy. The act would be anything but tidy in memory. We moved then in a choreography of confusion and duty. Men from the demolition team, civilian contractors cleared to do such work, whose names were also redacted as indefinito in later papers, brought in plastic explosives, packed into shaped charges, designed to bring down vaults without blowing the whole mountain apart. They worked with calipers and chalk lines, with the precision of men who cut away to reveal an answer. They were efficient and emotionless in their competence. I watched them place the charges and wrapped my hands around a coffee cup that had gone cold. Watching is a strange exercise. It feels like trying to prevent something by existing as an observer. I remember a young technician whispering, "We could sedate them deeper, ship them by rail to a research site inland." He believed in logistics as a salvation. A man in a suit told him logistics was secondary to prevention. The conversation had the shapes of old arguments, human life versus systemic safety. They chose system. Orders came to evacuate the non-essential. The point men, including me, were told we would be the last to leave.
We were to make sure any secured specimens were crated, and that no living thing could get past the perimeter. I looked at the crated subject that had been sedated and strung into a wooden box. Its chest rose like a small bellows under the slats. I looked at the techs, their faces washed with cafeteria light, and I thought of how the military trains you to follow. That training is a muscle that grows and can hurt. We started to pull out. In the confusion of lit corridors and dust, 2 technicians set a crate on the flatbed. They struggled with the straps. A man who had been part of the transfer team, someone whose hands had been gentle with hooks and harnesses, stood near a hatch and watched the snow of dust motes. For reasons that haunt me, he stepped back from the flatbed, grabbed a flare, and then turned toward the hatch with a purpose that was not an order. He popped the flare, and the sudden orange light drew every eye like a moth to flame. When the flare went up, a sound like fabric ripping came from the hatch. The tall form, the one I had seen uncoiling, pushed itself through the service opening with a wet, leaf-like motion. It looked not at the flare but past it, toward a figure on the flatbed who had been reaching for a strap. I remember thinking it might go to that man and wrap limbs around him like a lost thing. The mental image is still enough to make me breathe wrong. The flare set off a reflex in the men beside me. They fired.
The thing collapsed back into the shaft and the hatch clanged. There was a short, horrific silence as men realized what had just happened. The man on the flatbed was unhurt. He was shaken and silent. I slid a hand into my chest pocket and felt for the grand things that men carry as proof of moral fiber, and found nothing but the small lie that you did what you had to. With the flare incident, the calculus for the general hardened. He told the officers present that the risk vector had shifted from containment to exposure. The calculation was simple on paper. The more time the facility stayed intact with active breaches, the higher the chance something got out. The option with the lowest curve of risk was to collapse the lower rings and bury the tanks. He called it a denial strategy. He called it containment by attrition. The words were clinical. The act would be the opposite. There was no public debate. There was no town hall. There were blue lights and men who set charges and a list of names signed with hands that would later be told to forget. We were issued ear protection and told to stand clear. The demolition team closed the final circuits and took snapshots of charge placements for the log. I do not know how much of that log remains of record. Those who asked for it later were told there were extenuating circumstances, and the file was either redacted or marked indefinito. Before the detonation, I found Dr. Waller standing in front of a tank bay, hands flat on the glass of an empty tank.
I walked up slowly because you do not interrupt someone's grief. "Is there another way?" I asked him. He shook his head and opened his mouth as if to speak the name of a world that might take them. He said, "We tried to make sure they had a place, but command will not have their uncertainty on the books. They want a ledger that balances." He added, "It's not for me to say anymore." He looked at me then and said in a small voice, "Remember that they looked." They set the charges to eat the lower ring inward. The explosion pattern was meant to dislodge the support ribs and let gravity do the rest. There would be a crater, dust, and an explanation that fit a conservative news cycle: accidental collapse during containment operation, or a structural failure exacerbated by recent seismic activity. Those explanations would be applied like a varnish. The first detonation was a thud felt in the marrow. It was not loud at first because we were far, but it had the depth of a large animal falling. The second and third went with the insistent timing of a metronome. Then the main charges blew. The ring gave. Concrete buckled and metal screamed as stressed beams ruptured. Dust rose like a solid thing, a cloud that swallowed light. I saw men with faces flensed by dust and a hole opening where floor had been. The flatbed rocked, and for a single second the idea that we had sealed everything felt like relief. When the dust settled, there was a smell of burnt oil and stone. The mountain had shifted in a way that made bones ache. We watched as a team in heavy gear went in to confirm kill and containment. They were briefed, they went in, they returned with hands empty and faces like people who'd seen more than they should have. There were bodies of equipment, twisted rails, and the glass of tanks broken and folded into themselves. The recovered crates were blackened and warped. I remember a technician who had worked there for years kneeling and weeping into the dust because a drum had been ruptured. We later learned that some of the captured specimens did not survive. Some were unaccounted for. After the blast, the official line emitted like steam. The general read a statement to the small internal press in the command tent. An unfortunate containment breach had forced immediate termination of the site to protect public safety. The message was accurate in tone but not in moral detail. The town of Cross Hollow would later be told that there had been an emergency and that authorities acted. People would grieve for a collapsed facility and for the dead who had names in a local paper. They would not know the details of what had been under the hill because the public record would be intentionally thin. We were left, the survivors, with the residue, the smell of dust in our clothes, the taste of iron in our mouths, and the knowledge of what had been done. Back at the staging area, men signed forms.
We were told the operation was under an indefinito classification and that public communications were to be handled at a higher clearance. We were told to maintain secrecy and told, in tones of spare kindness, that it was a matter of national security. The men from the demolition team packed up their gear and left with faces like people who had been paid for a hard job and were relieved it was done. They issued NDAs that night. The packet was thin and padded with legalese. We were told the agreement was to protect sensitive methodologies and prevent panic. They told us it was standard. I signed because the alternative was not pleasant. Refusal would mean courts-martial and a prolonged public questioning I was not eager for. The forms were stamped with the kind of clearance designation they told me later to call indefinido. I took my pen and made my mark. The ink felt like a small betrayal, but also like a necessary thing to survive. Afterwards, there were whispers and rumors that a few of the more senior researchers were reassigned to other projects under the auspices of program realignment, another euphemism that means people are sent to places less public. Dr. Waller was quietly moved. I ran into him once in a corridor months later. We nodded but said nothing. He had the look of a man who had been hollowed out and refilled with the duty of doing the next thing. The investigation that followed was perfunctory. Papers were filed that said structural compromise due to unknown factors and loss of life regretted. I tried to follow the record with FOIA requests after leaving the service. The files that returned were redacted at the edges like photographs cut to hide what stands at the margins. The coordinates in my copy of the folder had been crossed through and labeled with a security notation. When I asked former colleagues about certain names, their eyes either slid away or hardened. The unit that had been attached to the site was disbanded. Men received commendations for actions that had been called bravery under pressure in the lines of the citation. I was offered a reassignment that would have been a promotion in many eyes: relocation to a quieter post, a small ribbon, an opportunity to climb the ladder. I turned it down. The offer was an attempt to make me complicit in forgetting. I didn't accept. I left the service months later with my discharge papers and a small stack of memories that fit no neat classification. I married, yes, and had a life that outwardly conformed to the American ideal of the era: a job, a porch, and the smell of coffee on Saturday mornings. But there were nights when the mountain lifted out of my sleep like a clay relief, and the tilt of those eyes would return to me. I would wake with the sensation of a glass pressed against my palm and imagine the question those eyes had asked: what rights apply to something that notices you? Time does strange things to memory.
People think either that memory corrodes slowly or that it stays bright like a burn. Both are true. Some images are as crisp as if carved yesterday, the way a CRT glowed in the dim control room, the hiss of pneumatic seals, the way dust hung in a shaft like lint in a sunbeam. Other things fade: the exact wording of a command, the number on a crate, the badge number of an officer who gave an order. When I try to reconcile what I saw with what the record allows, the gray area is large. I learned to watch how language is used to collapse reality into acceptability. We were told neutralization and denial in place of endings. We were told containment of hazard in place of burial. The vocabulary protects those who give the orders and leaves the rest of us holding language that is not yet big enough to carry the weight of what we have seen. There were, after the event, small consequences that hinted at longer echoes. A local farmer outside Cross Hollow reported a sinkhole near a ridge that had not been there before. An old man who liked to fish upstream said his best spot had a new current that made his line snap on the first cast. These were small, unconnected notes at the time, and may have nothing to do with what happened in the tunnel. People who live near mountains are prone to attributing meaning to shifts in the land because it is their lifeblood. I don't claim these things as proof. I only tell them because they were the minor tremors felt by a community after a blow. I have kept holdings of memory that I have no right to distribute. I had a roll of film that I thought might contain frames that would answer the question of what they looked like when the glass was removed. The film was confiscated at the base the same night of the demolition. I filed a complaint and was told it had been secured for evidentiary purposes. Later, the trail went cold. When I asked for its return, legal hands folded and the words chain of custody and security risk were used in place of empathy. The film did not return. I tried once to pull myself into action beyond memory. I wrote letters to representatives and asked if there were oversight hearings for operations conducted on federal land. My letters received replies that used phrases about national interest and safety considerations. I found that for the parts of our country that taste of secrecy, bureaucracy becomes a wall. People at a distance may say, "We trust that those with proper clearance acted accordingly," and those words are the cement that keeps small truths locked in little boxes. Over the years, rumors have circulated, as rumors do, about what the specimens were. Some people suggested extraterrestrial origins. Others whispered about genetic chimeras, Cold War-era experiments, or a failed attempt to use something for missile targeting. All of these are speculation. I do not have the evidence to name their origin.
I have only the observation that they were aware, and that how we treated awareness speaks to how we define responsibility. I think sometimes about the men and women who worked in that facility. They were not monsters. They were people. Some of them looked like they carried regret in ways that could not be erased by a paycheck or a reassignment. That moral residue does not disappear. The work they did, whether funded by a defense ledger or a private grant, was human work, done by pinch-faced people at the edges of what government will do to keep a balance between fear and order. What stays with me, beyond dusty nightmares and legal redactions, is an image, a hand, or a limb we could not comfortably name, pressed against a glass with the wrong kind of patience. The thing didn't thrash. It raised itself as if to meet us, and in that meeting was the question about rights and recognition. When a government decides that a being cannot be given the latitude of personhood, it creates a moral calculus that tastes sour on the tongue. I am often asked, by strangers and by people who claim to be researchers, whether I think they were extraterrestrial. My answer is the same. I do not know. I saw intelligence in a form I could not map onto our categories. I saw something that recognized the presence of watchers. That, to me, was a fact as real as the concrete ribs and the green glow of CRT monitors. Everything else, origin, purpose, whether they could speak or think in a way that mapped to us, remains speculative. If you ask me what I believe, I will tell you what I have said before. I trust what my senses told me, and I respect my inability to draw a full conclusion from their shape. The moral weight of what happened has been a private burden. There are nights when I wonder whether the route we chose, to bury and erase rather than to relocate and care, was the only option. The men who made the orders made them under constraints I cannot know fully. The fear of contamination, the paranoia of a Cold War era that rewarded secrecy, and the calculus of national security that often places objectivity above compassion. I do not absolve those who sat at tables and signed papers. I also cannot presume to hold their keys. If anything can be salvaged from this story, it is this. Watch carefully how language is used to make intolerable acts administratively acceptable. Watch how a decision called denial can hide a moral choice. And watch the faces of the people who did the work, because they are the ones who will carry the memory forward. I do not go looking for trouble now. I do sometimes drive past ridgelines and see the way the tree line corrals the sky, and I imagine what lays under rock. I am not a man of action anymore. I am a man of witness, and witnessing is a kind of work. It is less heroic than it sounds. It involves telling the truth as you remember it, and then sitting with the knowledge that the world may prefer a smoother narrative.
If you dig into the public record of federal facilities in the Appalachian Ridges around 1971, you will not find a neat ledger entry that explains every oddity we saw. You will find, at best, omissions and bureaucratic language. If you believe this matters, then press for transparency. Ask for copies of reports, for audit trails, for names that have been blacked out. The more light that is shined into a place, the harder it is for a decision to be rendered without consequence. I suppose some will hear this and slide it into the drawer marked conspiracy or fantasy. Others will call it a soldier's attempt to find meaning in paperwork. That's fair. Memory is messy. But I will stand by what I saw. Locked corridors that did not appear on the books, tanks with living forms that watched us, instruments that pulsed with rhythms we could not identify, and a command decision that chose demolition and silence over disclosure. In the quiet nights, I sometimes imagine a future in which someone with enough curiosity and not enough wariness will hike up into a ridge and find the ribs of the old facility exposed by erosion. They might find a sliver of metal, a twisted piece of tank glass, a charred length of rail. If they do, what then? Will they call authorities who will look and say, "Nothing to see here," and file a report? Or will they have the courage to ask difficult questions of governments, of contractors, of an entire culture that sometimes chooses forgetfulness over the hard work of reckoning? I don't offer this as proof. I offer it as testimony from a man who was there and who carries the weight of what he saw inside the mountain. I do not demand belief. I demand only that people be willing to question the shape of what power decides to hide. That is the last thing I will say. If you ever stand at the edge of the Appalachian Ridge on a clear day and see a line of trees that seem unnaturally straight or a depression that looks recent, bend your head and listen. Listen for the small, machine hum of a generator long gone. Listen for the scuttle of animals. Listen for nothing at all. Sometimes silence itself is the loudest testimony, a silence built deliberately and placed like a lid.
If you hear that silence, remember, it can be broken by asking the right questions. One last note about names and designations. Whatever specific clearance levels or program names were used in the paperwork associated with that site were marked by command as beyond the remit of those of us on the scene. Where a document called for a label, I have used indefinito because I cannot, in good conscience, invent a real-world correlate. Any official-sounding names you hear from me are either the actual ranks I held at the time or placeholders where the document was later redacted. Treat those placeholders as markers of absence rather than as evidence. If this account moves you, if it sets a small ember of doubt or curiosity alight, then do something with it.
Ask questions. Read the records available to you. Demand clarity where secrecy has been used to paper over conscience. Above all, remember that the story I tell is testimony and not an archival certificate. It is my memory. It is haunted by the sight of eyes at glass. Thank you for listening to this debrief from the Ridge. If you want to hear other first-hand accounts of military mysteries from the same era, told plain and straight without flourish, consider watching more of these testimonies. If enough people ask the hard questions, perhaps the ledger will be opened a little wider. If you have questions, leave them, but remember, sometimes answers are slower than the urgency of a single burning curiosity.